Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a few minutes about imaginary cities, a tour of dream cities, nightmare cities, and everywhere in between by Darran Anderson, which is a book that I recently finished reading. And this book was originally published back in 2015, from what I can tell, in the UK. This edition that I read is a University of Chicago Press edition from 2017. I read this electronically. This is a work of nonfiction about cities, really the imagination of cities. And I wanted to read it because I'm really sort of fascinated with cities, how things came to be the way they are, how cities formed, how they've evolved through time, and then those cities, that have come and gone and disappeared from history. I just find all of that really fascinating. So I thought this book really might be for me. So this book was a daydream about cities. So it was structured very non-linearly and very fluidly. It is sort of divided into sections. So I thought what I would do, I thought a lot about how to present this chat for this particular book, but I thought what I would do is just go through, or I would at least name off these different sections, although these different sections don't really necessarily reflect what's in them. So it's not grouped by topic. It's really a free flow of ideas. This is definitely a book that when you read it, you need to have Google open, or you need to have some sort of reference available for you, because there's a lot of references to literature, film, art, architects of the past and present. So a lot of things I did, and I had to look up like millions of things. And this book did not have, the edition at least that I read, did not have illustrations. And so I didn't always take the time to look up what something actually looked like. But I think that would also enrich the reading experience. If I were to go back and read the book now, I would understand that it's not going to be linear, and that it's going to be sort of a daydream or a meditation on cities and the different components of cities. But I don't know if I'll get around to reading it again anytime soon. It's quite long. It's over 500 pages, I believe, if I remember right. I did read it electronically, so I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, I thought I'd just run through these different sections. At least that would give you some sort of idea of what's talked about in the book, and then I'll go over some different thoughts I had after I finished reading it. But all right, so the first section is called "The Men of a Million Lies," or How We Imagine, and he kind of kicks off this whole story about with Plato and the cave, and so how we sort of imagine the world around us, and of course the cities that we live in. So the next section is called "The Tower," and again, this is not one theme in this book is the Tower of Babel. It's talked about quite extensively, but there's other things discussed in this in this section, like towers, different towers that have been planned by architects but not built, towers all around the world that existed in cities previously and presently. So a lot there. The third section is called "The Alchemical Cities," and again, this is not linear and it's not historical, but mentioned in this section were Atlantis and El Dorado, some of these sort of mythical cities that have existed or exist in our myths. And then the next section is called "The Abiding Desire of No Place." And I don't really remember what's this section. I think no place, the desire of no place is sort of being outside of a city. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a bit when I get to some of my final thoughts on the book. And then "Remembering the Future" is the next section. So remembering the future is, I think if I remember right, some discussion of futuristic cities, like in Blade Runner, for example, which is a future city sort of presented in sort of a dystopian light. He does talk about how the ruins of a city or the ruins of any building are built into it, like right there. Like if you walk into a building today, it could already be sort of imagined as a ruin, because ultimately all buildings turn to ruin eventually, right? So the next section is called "The Turk." And this was about, this section kicked off with a discussion about this automaton from the 18th century, from the Ottoman Empire. And then the rest of this section sort of loosely dealt with the mechanics of a city, mechanical cities, and the mechanics of a city. And then finally, the last section is called Flotsam and Jetsam. That's cities that come and go, the ruins of cities, like I mentioned already. So this is how the book is loosely structured, but none of these chapters really point to any one given subject of that section. It's sort of really all over the place, and the book really needs to be read that way, and I think you have to really get comfortable with reading it that way. I think if I was going to read it again, I would understand that. It took me about halfway through the book to actually figure out this is what's going on. This is how the book is structured. I think the book is mentioned as a creative nonfiction, so it's a creative work of nonfiction. So it's not just an academic, maybe a history of imaginary cities, like I was kind of expecting, but it is far more creative and dreamlike. Sort of a free thought of ideas about any kind of given subject. So kind of thoughts that I've had following the book. So I did actually, once I finished the book, I did actually find a lot to reflect on and think about as far as cities. I didn't realize that this was affecting me this way when I was reading it. So if you do read the book, I would give yourself permission to get a little bit lost in all the references that you might not understand or know exactly who he's talking about, and just kind of go with it and then see where it takes you. But one thing that I kind of came out of it thinking about was this tension between the rural and the urban that always seems to exist, and I guess it's existed for a really long time. And even some really major architects of our time and the past, really, even though they were designing architecture and designing cities, they didn't like cities. They thought that man's best place was, outside cities, and so, or in rural areas, and that cities are an artificial creation. And it was kind of interesting to me about the story of the Tower of Babel, because this is mentioned, like I mentioned earlier, it is in the book and talked about off and on throughout the entire book, because I think in Western culture anyway, the Tower of Babel is sort of this symbol of the hubris of humans to build an artificial world for themselves, build a world outside of nature, which is a city, which is a pretty, basically a human construction. Granted, we have parks and things, but a city itself is a collection or an aggregation of human lives, basically. And so that tension between urban and rural and city, and living in being a city dweller versus a rural person, it's sort of this ever-present kind of tug between the two. And then kind of along those same lines is like one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. So I myself actually prefer urban areas. I've always lived in either towns or cities, and I actually prefer to live in sort of urban areas. But I have a cousin who were around the same age, grew up the same sort of environment, same sort of upbringing, and my cousin would actually go nuts living in a really urban area. So different people we experience the same place differently, and even the same city differently. So one thing that's mentioned in the book is how Scorsese's taxi driver, the Manhattan of Scorsese's taxi driver, is almost contemporaneous to Woody Allen's Manhattan, the movies. So very different worlds there in those different films. But so a city is different to whoever's in it or whoever's experiencing it, and also you can't really wake up in the same city twice, because a city is constantly changing. And so a city, you might think of this on the micro level. If you're living in a city, you might not necessarily notice this offhand, but if you're living in a city on any given day, something changes. A store opens, a store closes, a building is torn down, a building is built, people move into the city, people move out of the city, new people are being born, old people or other people are passing away, people are immigrating into the city and away from the city. So the actual structure and energy of a city is changing really by the hour, but we don't necessarily notice this. So if you were to leave your city, I think if you leave your a place that you've lived in a long time and you go back to it after maybe like 10 or 20 years, one thing that people often do is talk about what's changed or what's not changed. But even if the change seems rather glacial, it's definitely probably still there, because it's going to be different people that are inhabiting the city and different, even different structures and things like that. So, and along those lines, another kind of thing that I came away from it, one book that's mentioned in, one reference that's in this book is Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space, which I've actually chatted here on my channel, and I will link to that down below. But how space affects us, how space, the space around us, impacts our lives, and we don't necessarily know this consciously, but it does. The rooms we inhabit, the buildings we inhabit, the places we go for work, the places we go for business or for just life's daily activities. All of this really affects us consciously and emotionally and maybe even spiritually. And so a city, each city is different. There's no two the same. And so one thing about, back to this tension between the urban and the rural, it's discussed in the book a bit about suburbanization versus urbanization. Suburbanization was this ideal of it's better for us to live in a less densely populated area. And so suburbanization kind of was born in the 20th century, where it became kind of uniform, right? It became kind of standardized. So to me, to me, the urban aggregate is where a lot of creativity happens, because it's where a lot of energy is being exchanged and things like that. And a suburban environment is not that calming, but to people who prefer that sort of environment, the city is what creates anxiety. So again, different. One person's utopia is another person's dystopia. Heaven, as described in Christianity, to some people might seem like a paradise, and to others it might seem like eternity, with golden streets and not much to do. So might be a dystopia to others. So one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. One person's city that they're stepping foot in, the taxi driver in Manhattan versus the Woody Allen's Manhattan, really different experiences there. So I think I will stop the chat at that. The book, it kind of caught me off guard for about the first half of it, until I sort of got the rhythm of what this author was trying to creatively sort of daydream on all aspects of cities and buildings and just the places that we inhabit and in the geographic locations that we live, and those that exist in real life, those that have existed in history, as well as those who have just been that just exist in the imagination or in dreams. So I will stop the chat with that. I will have a book chat on this coming up very soon, Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. I've finished this book already, so I will get a chat up on this soon. This was mid-20th century hard-boiled detective fiction. A lot of fun to read, so I'll get a chat up on this coming up very soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.